The galaxy was old. It had seen empires rise and fall like waves on an endless ocean. Stars had been born and died while civilizations built their monuments across the void. And for 10,000 years, one alliance had ruled above all others. They called themselves the Concord of 12. 12 species, 12 great powers. They controlled the trade routes, the jump gates, and the laws that governed all who traveled between the stars. Their fleets numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their stations dotted every major system. To challenge them was to invite destruction. Humanity had joined this galaxy only 100 years ago. When their first ship crossed into conquered space, the aliens had looked upon them with curiosity and amusement. These creatures from the small blue world were clever. Yes, they learned quickly. They adapted well, but they were so very young. The Conquered gave humanity a seat at the table, but it was a small seat. A seat in the corner where the important voices could not hear them. Earth was allowed to trade, to travel, and to exist. Nothing more. Ambassador Yellen Vasquez understood this better than anyone. She stood in the great hall of the Concord Assembly, surrounded by beings that towered over her small human form. The Velkari delegates moved past her without a glance. Their scaled bodies gleamed under the artificial lights, and their four eyes looked through her as if she was made of glass. To them, she was barely worth noticing. The Thracian warlords sat in their section, massive creatures of muscle and bone. They wore their battle scars with pride and spoke of nothing but conquest and honor. When they looked at humanity's tiny fleet, they laughed. What honor could be found in fighting such weak prey? Yellen kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that showing anger only made things worse. So she smiled politely and took her seat in the corner. She listened to the great powers argue about trade agreements and border disputes. She raised her hand to speak and was ignored. She submitted proposals that were never read. This was her life. This was humanity's place in the galaxy. But Yellen carried a secret so important that only a handful of humans knew the truth. She thought about it often during these long meetings. While the aliens talked about their mighty fleets and their ancient histories, Yellen thought about a place far from any alien sensor. A place hidden in the cold darkness at the edge of Earth's solar system. The Oort cloud was a shell of ice and rock that surrounded humanity's home. It was vast and empty and utterly ignored by the rest of the galaxy. No alien had ever traveled there. Why would they? There was nothing of value in that frozen wasteland. Or so they believed. 80 years ago, when humanity first realized how small they truly were, a decision was made. The governments of Earth came together in secret. They looked at the galaxy and saw their future. They would always be weak. They would always be ignored. They would always be at the mercy of species who saw them as nothing more than clever animals, unless they changed the game. The project had no official name. Those who worked on it simply called it the Promise. For 80 years, humanity's greatest minds had labored in that frozen darkness. They built something that should have been impossible. They created a weapon that would make the galaxy tremble. A ship, but not just any ship. She was 5 kilometers long, a mountain of black steel and hidden fury. Her weapons were unlike anything the Conquered had ever seen. Her engines could tear holes in space itself. Her armor could withstand the fury of a star. They named her the Prometheus after the old Earth myth, the Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. She waited in the darkness, sleeping, patient. Her crew trained in secret, learning systems that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Her captain, Admiral Hana Yoon, had spent 30 years preparing for a day that might never come, and no alien had ever seen her. Not once, not ever. Yellen sometimes wondered if that day would arrive during her lifetime. She hoped not. The Prometheus was meant to be a last resort, a weapon of desperation. If she ever left the darkness, it would mean that something terrible had happened. The meeting ended, as it always did, with nothing achieved. Yellen gathered her papers and walked toward the exit. A Velkari diplomat stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I noticed your proposal for increased patrol rights near the Arterian Gap. Very amusing." "I am glad I could entertain you," Yellen replied calmly. "Your people have such imagination," the Velkari continued. building your little fleet from our scraps, playing at being a real power. It is almost charming. Other diplomats had stopped to watch. Some of them smiled. Others whispered to each other. We are grateful for the Concord's generosity, Yellen said. Her voice betrayed nothing. As you should be. Remember your place, human. You exist because we allow it. The Velkari walked away, his tail swishing behind him in satisfaction. The crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their important conversations about important matters. Yellen stood alone in the great hall for a long moment. Her face remained calm, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. She thought about the Prometheus sleeping in the darkness. She thought about the fire that waited to be unleashed. Someday, she thought, someday they would learn. She relaxed her hands and walked out of the hall with her head held high. That night, she sent her weekly report to Earth through encrypted channels. At the end, she added a personal note to the Admiralty. They still see nothing. They still suspect nothing. The promise remains safe. Far away, past the orbit of Neptune, past the scattered ice of the Kuiper Belt, past everything that the galaxy thought they knew about humanity, a single light blinked in response. The Prometheus was still waiting, and humanity was patient. They had learned that lesson from the galaxy itself. The universe did not care about fairness or justice. It only respected power. And power, true power, came to those who knew when to hide and when to strike. Humanity was not ready to strike. Not yet. But they would be. The stars continued their ancient dance, ignorant of the fire that slept in the darkness. The Concorde continued their rule, confident in their eternal power. And somewhere, in the cold void between worlds, a human ship dreamed of the day when she would finally wake. That day was coming closer than anyone knew. The warning came at midnight, Galactic Standard Time. Every communication channel in conquered space screamed with the same message. Emergency signals flooded the networks. Ships changed course. Governments activated their war protocols. The Keth-Vori swarm had returned. 10,000 years ago, before the Concorde existed, the swarm had nearly destroyed everything. They were not a species in the normal sense. They were a hunger-given form. Their ships were alive, grown from metal and flesh, twisted together into nightmarish shapes. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They only consumed. The ancient races had united against them in desperation. Billions had died. Entire star systems had been burned to stop the advance. In the end, the swarm had been pushed back into the dark spaces between galaxies. The survivors had formed the Concorde, swearing to stand together if the horror ever returned. And now it had. The Arterian Gap was a region of empty space at the edge of conquered territory. Nothing lived there. Nothing grew there. It was a dead zone, useful only as a shortcut for long-range travel. The swarm poured through it like a river of death. Their hive ships numbered in the thousands. Each one was a twisted mountain of organic metal, covered in weapons that grew from its body like tumors. They moved without formation, without strategy, driven only by an endless hunger to consume all life. 3 border worlds fell in the first week. The conquered received no distress calls from them. There was no time. One moment the colonies existed, and the next they were gone, devoured by the endless tide. The Velkari Grand Fleet mobilized immediately. Their ships were beautiful and deadly, armed with weapons that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. The Thracian war clans launched their dreadnoughts, eager for a worthy enemy at last. Even the smaller powers sent what they could. The combined fleet met the swarm at the Viridian Nebula. The battle lasted 3 days. The Concorde lost. It was not a defeat. It was a slaughter. The swarm did not fight like normal enemies. When their ships were damaged, they healed. When their weapons were destroyed, they grew new ones. For every hive ship that fell, 3 more emerged from the dark. The conquered fleet, the mightiest force in the galaxy, was pushed back like leaves before a storm. Admiral Kethron of the Velkari watched his tactical display with growing horror. Half his fleet was gone. The Thracian dreadnoughts, those legendary instruments of destruction, were retreating in disorder. Nothing they did seemed to matter. The swarm kept coming. Ambassador Yellen Vasquez received the news in her quarters on Concord Station. She read the casualty reports with a cold feeling spreading through her chest. The numbers were beyond imagination. Millions dead, worlds falling, the greatest powers in the galaxy running for their lives. And then she saw the next target. Sanctuary Station was a civilian hub in the Artemis system. It was home to 12 million souls from a dozen different species. 2 million of them were human. It was a place of trade, of culture, of families living their ordinary lives among the stars. It was directly in the swarm's path. Yellen immediately requested an emergency meeting with Fleet Admiral Kethron. She waited for hours before she was granted 5 minutes of his time. "Admiral," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "Sanctuary Station must be defended. 2 million of my people are there. Millions more from other species. You cannot abandon them." The Velkari Admiral looked at her with exhausted eyes. His scales had lost their shine. His movements were slow and heavy. "I cannot defend everywhere," he said. "The swarm is too strong. We must consolidate our forces at the core worlds. It is the only way to survive. You are condemning 12 million people to death. I am saving 12 billion. His voice was hard. "Sanctuary Station is too far from our defensive lines. Any fleet we send there will be destroyed. I will not waste ships on a battle we cannot win." "Please," Yellen said. She hated the desperation in her voice. "There must be something you can do." Admiral Catherine turned away from her. "I am sorry, Ambassador, truly, but your people are not worth the cost." The words hit her like a physical blow. Not worth the cost. 2 million human lives, and they were not worth the cost. She left his office in silence. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding. She walked through the corridors of Concord Station, past aliens who did not notice her, past guards who did not care. When she reached her quarters, she sealed the door and stood alone in the darkness. For a long moment, she did not move. She thought about Sanctuary Station. She thought about the families there, the children, the people who had trusted that the galaxy would protect them. She thought about the Prometheus. The decision should have been difficult. It should have required consultation, authorization, endless debate. But Yellen had been authorized to make this call years ago, in a secret meeting that no record of existed. She activated her secure terminal. Her fingers moved across the keys, entering codes that only a handful of people knew. The signal would travel through hidden relays, bouncing across the solar system until it reached the cold darkness of the Oort cloud. She typed 2 words, "Prometheus Protocol." For a moment, nothing happened. The universe continued as before. The swarm advanced, the Concorde retreated. Sanctuary Station began its futile evacuation. Then far away, something woke up. In the frozen darkness at the edge of humanity's home, lights began to glow. Systems that had slept for decades came alive. A crew that had trained for this moment their entire lives moved to their stations. Admiral Hana Yoon stood on her bridge and read the message on her screen. Her face showed no surprise. She had always known this day would come. "All hands," she said into the ship-wide channel. "This is the Admiral. The time has come. Prepare for departure." Around her, the Prometheus began to wake. Her engines powered up for the first time in 80 years. Her weapon systems ran through their final checks. Her hull, 5 kilometers of black steel and hidden fury, began to vibrate with barely contained power. The promise was about to be kept. Yellen sat in her quarters, staring at the screen. She had just changed the course of history. She had revealed humanity's greatest secret. There was no going back now. She thought about what the Velkari Admiral had said. Your people are not worth the cost. Soon, she thought, they would learn exactly what humanity was worth. The Prometheus moved out of the darkness and aimed herself at the stars. She had a long way to go and millions of lives to save. Captain Dmitry Novak watched the enemy approach and knew he was going to die. His ship, the UES Relentless, was a small frigate. She had been built from parts purchased at alien junkyards, repaired 1,000 times, held together by human stubbornness and prayers. She was never meant to fight a battle like this, but she was all that stood between the swarm and Sanctuary Station. Dimitri's fleet, if it could be called that, consisted of 7 ships, 3 frigates like his own, 2 converted cargo haulers with weapons strapped to their hulls, 2 civilian yachts whose owners had refused to run. Against them came 300 swarm hive ships. The tactical display showed the enemy as a cloud of red dots, moving closer with each passing second. Behind Dmitri, Sanctuary Station was launching evacuation shuttles. They were trying to save as many people as possible, but everyone knew the truth. The shuttles were too slow. The swarm was too fast. No one was coming to save them. All ships, Dmitri said into his communicator, hold formation. We give them everything we have. Buy as much time as possible. The other captains responded with quiet acknowledgments. There were no heroic speeches, no grand declarations, just ordinary people preparing to die so that others might live a few minutes longer. The battle began. The human ships opened fire with everything they had. Missiles streaked across the void. Energy weapons painted bright lines against the darkness. A few swarm vessels were hit, their organic hulls burning briefly before regenerating. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The swarm returned fire. The first human ship, a cargo hauler named the Hope's Promise, exploded in a ball of flame. Her crew of 43 died instantly. Close the gap, Dmitri ordered. Get in close where their big weapons cannot track us. The Relentless surged forward, diving into the swarm fleet like a mouse attacking a pack of wolves. At close range, the frigate's weapons were more effective. Dmitri saw pieces of hive ship armor spinning away into space, but there were too many of them. Another human ship died, then another. The yacht captains, brave fools who had refused to run, were torn apart by concentrated fire. Dmitri felt each death like a wound in his own chest. His ship shook as enemy fire struck the hull. Alarms screamed. Damage reports flooded his console. The Relentless was bleeding atmosphere from a dozen breaches. Hull integrity at 40%, his first officer reported. Her voice was calm despite the chaos. We have maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was all they had left to give. Dmitri looked at his crew. Young faces, scared faces, determined faces. They knew they were dying. They kept fighting anyway. This is what humanity is, he thought. This is what we have always been. Then his sensor officer shouted something that made no sense. Captain, gravity distortion detected. Something is coming through folded space. Dmitri turned to his display. At first, he did not understand what he was seeing. The readings were impossible. The energy signature was larger than anything he had ever encountered. Larger than a Valkyrie command ship. Larger than a Thracian dreadnought. Larger than anything the galaxy had ever built. Behind the swarm fleet, space began to tear itself apart. It started as a ripple, like a stone dropped into still water. Then the ripple became a wave. Then the wave became a wound in reality itself. The distortion was so powerful that it pulled nearby swarm ships off course. Some of them spun helplessly. Others were torn apart by the gravitational forces. From the wound emerged a shape. She was darkness given form. 5 kilometers of angular black steel, bristling with weapons that glowed with barely contained energy. Her hull was covered in systems that Dmitri did not recognize, technologies that should not have existed. She moved through the rift like a predator entering a room full of prey. On her side, written in letters of burning white, were 2 words in Old Earth script. UES Prometheus. Dmitri stared at the screen. His mind could not process what he was seeing. The United Earth Navy did not have dreadnoughts. They did not have ships like this. No one had ships like this. What is that? His first officer whispered. Before Dmitri could answer, his communication system crackled with a new signal. The voice that came through was human, female, and utterly calm. Unknown human vessels. This is Admiral Hana Yun of the United Earthship Prometheus. Stand down and withdraw to safe distance. We will handle this. The channel went dead. Dmitri looked at his crew. They looked back at him with the same stunned expression. On the tactical display, the swarm fleet had stopped its advance. For the first time since the battle began, the enemy seemed uncertain. The Prometheus continued forward, her weapons powering up. The glow from her energy systems grew brighter and brighter until it hurt to look at. And then she opened fire. The first shot was a rail cannon round traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. It struck a hive ship and passed through it completely, leaving a hole the size of a stadium. The hive ship fell apart like a toy broken by an angry child. The second shot was a beam of focused energy that swept across 3 vessels at once, cutting them in half. The third shot was a cluster of missiles that moved too fast to track, impacting a dozen targets simultaneously. The swarm tried to react. They fired back with everything they had. Their organic weapons launched waves of projectiles at the human dreadnought. The Prometheus did not slow down. Point defense systems, thousands of them, created a sphere of destruction around her hull. Every swarm projectile was intercepted. Every attack was stopped. She was untouchable. Dmitri watched in silence as the monster he had never known existed tore through the swarm fleet like it was nothing. Ships that had threatened the entire galaxy were dying by the dozens. The aliens who had seemed unstoppable were running for their lives. His communication system crackled again. This time it was Sanctuary Station. "Human vessels, what is happening? Our sensors are showing. We do not understand. What is that ship?" Dmitri found his voice at last. It came out as a whisper, but it grew stronger as he spoke. "That ship," he said, "is humanity." On the screen, the Prometheus continued her work. The swarm continued to die, and the galaxy began to understand that everything they thought they knew about Earth was wrong. Admiral Hana Yun stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and watched the enemy burn. She was 63 years old. She had spent 30 of those years preparing for this moment. Every simulation, every drill, every sleepless night had led to this battle. And now that it was finally happening, she felt nothing but cold focus. "Target Cluster 7, she said calmly. "Rail cannons, full spread." Her weapons officer responded instantly. The ship shuddered as 8 rail cannons fired simultaneously. 8 hive ships died in the same second, their organic hulls torn apart by projectiles moving at impossible speeds. "Energy weapons charging," another officer reported. "Ready in 15 seconds. Fire when ready. Sweep pattern Delta." The beams lanced out, bright enough to blind anyone watching without protection. They moved across the swarm fleet like scythes through wheat. Ships that had terrified the galaxy for millennia were cut apart like paper. The Prometheus moved forward without slowing. She was a hammer, and the swarm was glass. On the tactical display, enemy signatures were disappearing faster than the computer could track. What had been 300 hive ships was now less than 200, then less than 100, then fewer still. The swarm tried to adapt. They always adapted. It was what made them so dangerous. A group of 20 hive ships moved to surround the Prometheus. They attacked from all directions at once, pouring fire into her hull. Their weapons struck true, hitting the black steel again and again. Hana watched the damage reports. Hull integrity remained at 98%. The armor of the Prometheus was not normal metal. It was a composite material that humanity had developed in secret, layer upon layer of advanced alloys designed to absorb and redirect energy. The swarm's weapons, deadly enough to destroy Valkyrie warships, barely scratched the surface. "Point defense, clear them out," Hana ordered. Thousands of small weapons on the ship's hull came alive. They fired continuously, creating a sphere of death around the Prometheus. Every swarm projectile was intercepted. Every piece of organic debris was vaporized. The hive ships that had tried to surround her were shredded in seconds. The swarm tried a new tactic. Their largest hive ship, a monster twice the size of the others, moved directly at the Prometheus. It was attempting to ram, to sacrifice itself in hopes of bringing down the human vessel. Hana watched it come without fear. "Main cannon," she said. "Fire." The Prometheus had many weapons: rail cannons, energy beams, missile clusters, point defense arrays. But her main cannon was something else entirely. It was a weapon that should not have existed, a technology that broke every rule the galaxy thought it knew. It fired once. A beam of pure white energy, brighter than a star, struck the massive hive ship directly. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the hive ship began to glow. The glow spread across its entire hull, growing brighter and brighter. And then it simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris. The ship and everything in it was converted directly into energy and scattered across the void. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. Across the battlefield, every alien watching felt the same emotion: terror. The swarm broke. For the first time in recorded history, the Keth Vori swarm retreated. Their remaining ships turned and fled, racing back toward the Arterian Gap. They moved with the speed of pure panic, abandoning their formation, abandoning their wounded, thinking only of escape. Hana let them go. "Do not pursue," she ordered. "Our mission is to protect, not to hunt. Let them run." The bridge was silent. Her crew was staring at their displays, watching the enemy signatures disappear into the distance. After years of training, after decades of preparation, it was over. 18 minutes. That was how long the battle had lasted. 18 minutes to destroy a force that had defeated the combined fleets of the Concorde. Hana allowed herself a small breath of relief. Then she returned to work. "Open a channel to the civilian station," she said. "Let them know they are safe." Far from the battlefield, Captain Dmitry Novak drifted in his crippled ship and tried to understand what he had just witnessed. The Relentless was barely functional. Her engines were dead. Her life support was failing. Half his crew was injured, but they were alive. Against all odds, against all logic, they had survived. He watched the Prometheus on his screen, floating peacefully amid the wreckage of the swarm fleet. She was untouched, unscratched. After destroying nearly 300 enemy vessels, she looked exactly the same as when she had arrived. His communication officer was crying. Silent tears rolled down her face as she listened to the messages coming from Sanctuary Station. Joy, relief, prayers of gratitude in a dozen different languages. "Captain," she said, her voice breaking, "they are asking who saved them. They want to know who we should thank." Dmitri thought about it for a moment. How could he explain what had happened? How could he describe a ship that should not exist, fighting a battle that should have been impossible? "Tell them," he said slowly, "that Earth sends its regards." On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Yoon received a report from her sensor officer. "Admiral, we are detecting multiple observation drones in the area. Velkari, Thracian, at least 4 other species. They have been recording everything." Hana nodded. She had expected this. The moment the Prometheus revealed herself, she knew the whole galaxy would be watching. "Let them watch," she said. "Let them see what we are." She thought about the years of secrecy, the decades of hiding. She thought about Ambassador Vasquez and all the insults she had endured. She thought about the Velkari diplomat who had told her that humanity was not worth the cost. They would never say that again. The recordings of this battle would spread across the galaxy within hours. Every species, every government, every military analyst would study what had happened here. They would count the swarm dead. They would measure the Prometheus against their own ships. They would calculate and analyze and debate. And in the end, they would all reach the same conclusion. Humanity was not what they thought. Hana looked at her crew. Young faces, proud faces, exhausted faces. They had done something incredible today. They had proven that Earth was not a minor species, not a collection of scavengers living on alien scraps. They were something else entirely. "Set course for Sanctuary Station," she ordered. "We have wounded to help and repairs to coordinate. The battle is over, but our work is not done." The Prometheus turned slowly, her massive hull catching the light of distant stars. Behind her, the wreckage of the swarm fleet drifted in silence. Ahead, millions of saved lives waited to meet their saviors. Hana sat back in her command chair and watched the stars. The secret was out. The promise had been kept, and humanity's place in the galaxy would never be the same. She allowed herself a small smile. It was about time. The recordings spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Within hours, every major news network was broadcasting footage of the battle. Billions of beings watched the Prometheus emerge from folded space. They watched her tear through the swarm fleet like it was made of nothing. They watched the most feared enemy in galactic history run away in terror. And they watched the human ship float untouched amid the wreckage. Not a single mark on her hull. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. On Velkar Prime, the homeworld of the galaxy's most arrogant species, the government called an emergency session. Their military analysts had studied the footage frame by frame. Their scientists had examined every weapon the Prometheus had used. Their conclusions were terrifying. The rail cannons were twice as powerful as anything in the Concorde arsenal. The energy beams used frequencies that should have been impossible to generate. The main cannon, the one that had erased a hive ship from existence, was something they could not explain at all. And the armor. The Velkari had fired everything they had at swarm ships without success. The Prometheus had shrugged off the same attacks like they were nothing. How? The Velkari demanded. How had the humans done this? No one had an answer. On Thrace, the warrior homeworld, the reaction was different. The Thracian warlords watched the battle in silence. When it was over, the High Marshal rose from his throne and spoke a single word. Respect. It was the highest compliment a Thracian could give. For a species that valued strength above all else, the Prometheus represented something almost sacred. True power, true dominance, a warrior worthy of honor. The High Marshal ordered a message sent to Earth. It was brief and simple. The clans of Thrace wish to speak with your admiral. She has earned the right. Across the Concord, reactions ranged from fear to awe to outrage. Species that had dismissed humanity for a century suddenly wanted answers. How long had Earth been hiding this ship? What other secrets did they possess? Could they build more? Were they a threat? Ambassador Yellen Vasquez arrived at the Concord Assembly 3 days after the battle. The chamber that had always ignored her was now packed with delegates from every species. Every eye turned to watch her enter. She walked to her usual seat in the corner. Then she stopped, looked around, and walked instead to the central platform where only the most important speakers stood. No one objected. She stood in silence for a long moment, letting them wait. She looked at the Velkari delegates, the ones who had called her people scavengers. She looked at the Thracian observers, the ones who had laughed at humanity's tiny fleet. She looked at Admiral Kethron, who had told her that human lives were not worth the cost. Then she spoke. 100 years ago, humanity entered this galaxy. We were young. We were weak. We had nothing but our courage and our will to survive. You gave us a seat at your table, and we were grateful. We accepted our place. We learned your languages, your customs, your rules. She paused, her voice steady and calm. We also learned something else. We learned that the galaxy does not respect kindness. It does not reward patience. It only respects power. And so, while you watched us buy your scraps and fly your hand-me-down ships, we were building something else. The chamber was absolutely silent. The Prometheus is not a violation of any treaty. We broke no laws. We simply chose not to show you everything we had. Perhaps that was dishonest. Perhaps it was unfair. But I remember standing in this very chamber, begging for help to save 12 million innocent people. I remember being told that my species was not worth the cost. She looked directly at Admiral Kethron. The Velkari could not meet her gaze. The Prometheus saved those people. She saved Sanctuary Station. She defeated an enemy that your combined fleets could not stop. And she did it in 18 minutes. Yellen let that number hang in the air. 18 minutes. Humanity does not seek war with the Concord. We do not wish to conquer or dominate. We want only what we have always wanted, a fair place among the stars, the right to protect our people, the respect we have earned. She straightened her shoulders and spoke her final words with quiet intensity. The Prometheus is not a threat to this alliance. She is a promise that Earth will never again wait for permission to defend its children. A promise that humanity will never again depend on the mercy of those who consider us worthless. She looked around the chamber one last time. We are not scavengers. We are not primitives. We are human. And from this day forward, you will remember that. She stepped down from the platform and walked out of the chamber. The doors closed behind her with a soft sound that somehow felt like thunder. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for decades suddenly moved forward. Humanity received access to jump gates that had been denied for years. Species that had ignored Earth's diplomats now requested audiences. Military alliances were proposed. Scientific partnerships were offered. The Velkari government quietly removed the diplomats who had insulted humanity so openly. They were never seen in public again. The Thracians invited Admiral Yoon to their homeworld. She spent a week there, meeting with their greatest warriors. When she left, she carried a ceremonial blade, the highest honor a non-Thracian could receive. And in classified intelligence reports across 100 alien governments, analysts tried to answer the most troubling question of all. If the humans hid one dreadnought for 80 years, what else are they hiding? The answer came 3 months later. A Valkyrie spy satellite, watching Earth's solar system from a safe distance, detected an unusual energy signature near the Oort cloud. The satellite focused its sensors on the source, expecting to find perhaps a small station or research facility. Instead, it found 3 more construction yards. They were hidden in the darkness between stars, invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for them. And they were not empty. The satellite detected hull sections, engine components, weapon systems. The shapes taking form in those yards were massive, more Prometheus-class dreadnoughts, at least 3 of them, perhaps more. The Valkyrie intelligence officer who reviewed this data stared at his screen for a very long time. Then he quietly deleted the report and told no one what he had seen. Some truths were better left unknown. On Earth, life continued as it always had. People went to work, raised their children, dreamed their dreams. Most of them had no idea that their species had just changed its place in the universe. But in the halls of the United Earth Admiralty, in secure facilities that existed on no public record, the work continued. The Prometheus had been a promise, but she was never meant to be alone. Humanity had spent 10,000 years looking up at the stars and wondering what lay beyond. Now they knew, and they had decided that whatever the galaxy contained, they would face it on their own terms. Not as scavengers, not as primitives, as equals. And if the galaxy ever forgot that lesson, humanity would be ready to remind them. In the cold darkness at the edge of the solar system, new ships were taking shape. They had names now: Olympus, Titan, Phoenix, Atlas. They slept in the void, waiting for the day they might be needed. And humanity, patient as always, watched the stars and planned for the future. Whatever that future might bring, they would be ready. They had made a promise, and humanity always kept its promises.